Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. My name is Dwayne, and with me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, it's 1986, and it is a big year.
Oh, man, there is so much going on. If you're ever arguing with somebody, some of your friends sitting around talking about what was the best year in the history of comics, I would submit that you could do much worse than arguing for 1986. There's a ton of interesting independent books that came out due to sort of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles opening the gates on that. You've got vibrant new small press publishers popping up everywhere. And not one, not two, but four of the most beloved stories in the history of comics were printed this year. So 1986, absolutely a banner year in terms of quality, in terms of quantity, and in terms of weird stuff that's going to have all sorts of impacts, good and bad, on comics for decades to come.
We've got a ton to talk about, and we get one of those beloved stories with our featured character as well.
Absolutely.
So this is going to be a big episode, so strap in, everybody. We're gonna jump right in and let's talk big picture about the year in comics. The year in comics. All right, Dan, it's 1986, and there is a lot to talk about. You prepped me before we started recording. You said we're going to try and keep this under 4 or 5 hours. So where exactly do we start with everything that is going on if we're looking big picture? Obviously, DC's probably doing some stuff. There's independent stuff. Where do we begin?
So, I mean, we always start with DC. And this year that means starting big again, because DC had essentially 3 or 4 things they did this year that were incredibly impactful. So the first thing, just to kind of continue over from 1985, we have the end of the Crisis. The fact that essentially the sort of complete changeover of the DC universe, where they take all of their multiverse characters and components, collapse them into a single universe, and then make something new out of that, completes in early 1990 or 1986. And then we get, for instance, Man of Steel, which is the new launch of Superman as essentially a revamped character in mid-1986 by John Byrne. Man of Steel is a 6-issue miniseries. It is incredibly popular. Sells like probably nearly 1 million copies a book or something like this. It's one of it's the highest selling title of 1986, and it allows Byrne to do something he'd been wanting to do for a long time, which is to essentially reset Superman, which is a favorite character of his, favorite character of lots of people, obviously, from back when he was younger, into a new context to get him ready for sort of relevance in the late 20th century. So he becomes once again the only Kryptonian. We have his parents are still alive, so Ma and Pa Kent are actually around, and he goes out and has still kind of a family life with them. He was never Superboy, which has ripple effects on the Legion of Superheroes. You also have changes in his supporting cast. Lois Lane becomes a far more independent and capable reporter, and she's far less interested in Clark Kent or Superman and Clark Kent and Superman and the like, and more interested in her own stuff. You have Lex Luthor turning into, instead of a sort of mad scientist who's going around in his big green suit, he turns into basically the Kingpin. He's a
Huh.
bald guy wandering around in a white suit who is a corporate sort of mogul. He's a billionaire type who is then set up more to be someone who uses politics and his corporate resources to try and take down Superman instead of ray guns. And that'll change over time, but at least at this point, he goes more to being a kind of a business bad guy instead of a superpowered or technology bad guy.
Sure.
They also are getting ready to do some other stuff. They cancel like Wonder Woman. We're going to see new changes in Wonder Woman and Batman come out next year. But besides the fact that essentially we have the Superman stuff, that also included the Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow book by Alan Moore, which some people say is one of the greatest Superman stories ever told. This was the book that was the two-part ending to Julius Schwartz's nearly 40-year career editing Superman. Alan Moore wrote it. Fantastic book that just basically goes through and sort of celebrates and reuses all the tropes of the Silver Age Superman. And then at the end of that, Superman titles go away for a little while, Man of Steel comes out, and we relaunch. The other two things are Frank Miller, our man Frank Miller, along with Jansen and Lynn Varley, wandering over to DC to create a little 4-part series called The Dark Knight Returns. You may have heard of it, right?
Yeah, that one's pretty well known.
Celebrated Batman book. Many people talk about it as one of their favorite Batman stories. It definitely is something that changed really the concept of how we think about Batman in a lot of ways. Because up until that point, Batman had some dark times. He'd had some times where he's a little bit more brooding. But there is a desperation and a psychosis and a brooding to the Bruce Wayne and the Batman of Dark Knight Returns that sort of transforms the way a lot of vigilante superheroes are portrayed in the next couple decades and even forward from that. But essentially the story is that Batman has retired, and at a certain point he sees that Gotham City is so corrupt, there's so much crime, there's so much suffering, that eventually he feels it's his duty to come out of retirement, take on the Joker, take on a lot of the gangs, and to essentially find a way to become his own force within the city. It is a very cynical take on society, and many people look at it now and say that there's something very fascist about it in the way that Batman works and the like. Even at the time, there were a number of folks who had their problems with it. I was 17 at the time. I did not get those sort of subtexts. I just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever read. So I was 100% on board for Dark Knight Returns. It was in a premium format, a perfect bound format, so you had more like a glued spine rather than one that had staples, and they used a better printing process and everything. The one problem was it was almost impossible to open the book to read it without making a crease on the front cover, thereby reducing the value of your precious, like, Dark Knight Returns #1. So I had a first printing of these, and then also multiple other ones over the time. When I was selling comics at flea markets, man, did I go through a lot of Dark Knight Returns books. You would think that would be... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that is a story that I think I really want to read at some point. It's one I've heard talked about with great reverence, and it is definitely one that is on my list of if I get a chance, I really want to read that story.
Yeah, it is interesting stuff, especially if you're a Batman fan who is used to sort of the old context of Batman. It was revelatory. What's interesting now is that a lot of the things that made it special then have become almost standard in Batman now. So I think you and a lot of people coming back to it will be like, oh yeah, this is a Batman comic. Where I was like, this is like no Batman I've ever seen before, right?
Sure.
So it may be a little hard to recapture the original, but it's still, you like Frank Miller, you like Frank Miller's Daredevil. This is in a similar vein. So
Sure.
You would think that would be DC's high point for the year, but in actual fact, they also came out with Watchmen in 1986, which Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons, Higgins on the colors. This book just absolutely blew up everything in the way that we look at comics as sort of a form. So Moore wanted to do a story based off of the characters that were originally the Archie superheroes. They couldn't get those, so he's like, how about I do the Charlton superheroes? They said, we're going to use them for something. Why don't you just make up your own characters? So he just made up his own characters and then created this very dark story about essentially a group of superheroes who had been active in previous years, had sort of been outlawed, went underground or into hiding or disappeared from public, and then one of them's murdered, and it starts this whole sort of cycle of events. It is incredibly different from a regular comic book. There's pages that have just almost like paragraphs and paragraphs of text. There's explanatory essays at the end of it. There are weird strategies for telling the story, like you'll have a story that leads the plot forward, and then you've got one that talks about, say, Rorschach for an entire issue. Then you've got another one that leads the plot forward. You've got one that talks about some other character for an entire issue. By the end of it, they've created this sort of absolutely beautiful story that deconstructs the very idea of the superhero form. And it blew people away to the point this won a Hugo Award, which comics had never won a Hugo Award before. It was listed in one of the top 500 novels in America by New Yorker or something like that a couple of years later. Just got accolades no other comic book had ever gotten. So, very cool stuff. Have you read Watchmen by any chance?
I have not read Watchmen either. I've seen the movie and the TV show that was done more recently, but not read the actual comics themselves. Again, another thing that's probably on my list of I should probably read this at some point, but I have not gotten around to it as of yet.
Well, I haven't watched the most recent TV series, but watching the movie was interesting. And I have a tough relationship with the movie, partly because one of the weird things is that when you look at Watchmen the series, it really makes you look at the characters, at the heroes, and see them in many ways as these sort of small, grimy, over-the-hill types of people. They're not sexy. They're not cool. You feel bad for Rorschach. He's almost one of those guys who flies are circling around his head all the sorts of time, right? The problem with the movie is that Zack Snyder made it, and he is pathologically enabled to not make things look cool and sexy. So everybody in Watchmen sort of, even as he tells the story completely faithfully, the pictures of the movie tell a completely different story that sort of changes the meaning. Right. And so it is interesting if you've watched the movie to go and still give a try to actually reading the books as well. They're well worth it. They've been rolled up, both Dark Knight and Watchmen have been rolled up into graphic novels now almost since they came out, and so you can just pick them up at any Barnes and Noble or Amazon or whatever and give them a read. Or your local library, always a great option, as my wife would note. So
yeah.
And then, as if that wasn't enough, we got the first volume of Maus, which came out this year, Art Spiegelman's masterpiece. It ends up being 2 volumes, but the first one, titled My Father Bleeds History, came out this year. Was immediately lauded as something spectacular. Again, makes lists of greatest novels and things like that. More in the collected edition that has all 12 parts in it rather than just the first one. But this, again, just opened up new avenues. Nobody'd ever thought of comic books as telling this sort of story and telling it in the way that it did. And there's something about comics being able to use sort of like he did the anthropomorphized animals, because he made all of the Jews mice, Germans were cats, the Americans were dogs. And by doing that, he was able to abstract things a little bit, where he could tell truly his horrific stories while still keeping you from having to be so viscerally connected to it that you couldn't finish the book. And
Right.
so, what it really is the story of his relationship with his father, and how his relationship with his parents, his mother who'd committed suicide, and his father who'd been deeply damaged by the events of what had happened to his family in the camps and during World War II, how that all played out over time, and sort of him coming to terms with his father and what had happened to him by telling his story. And so it's autobiographical. It's also got some other elements in it and the like, but just a fantastic, fantastic book. So again, all three of those make pretty much anybody's list of the top 10 comic stories ever told, right?
Right.
It would be hard, especially for people from my generation, folks who grew up with comics in the 80s and the like. These were our Mount Rushmore books, right?
Yeah.
These were the thing. The fourth one that we'll probably talk about more in this podcast is Frank Miller returned to Daredevil this year, and working with David Mazzucchelli did a story called Born Again, which I think to me is still the fundamental building block of Daredevil in terms of who he is as a character today. And that's saying a lot, because we've had some pretty good Daredevil stories the last couple of years. But Born Again is, again, when you get people to start taking a look at what their favorite Daredevil stories are, or what the best stories are, I think Born Again is often going to be, and it was on the CBR list I looked at and a couple others, one of those top 10 all-time comic stories. And
Yep.
by default then becomes the best Daredevil story ever. So looking forward to talking about that one with you.
Yeah, that one is going to take up a lot of our discussion a little bit later on. It definitely was a story I was looking forward to getting to, and I had no idea when it was coming. So when I started reading it, I was like, "Oh my gosh,
Yep.
this is something." But again, we've got a lot more we got to talk about before we even get to that. So, Dan, what else was going on in this year besides these just gigantic, like, these are the best of all time sort of stories that we were seeing?
So many other interesting things, because 86 is not just about quality at the top, it's also all of these new publishers coming in and trying things. Some of them are terrible. I will note there's probably more bad stuff made in 1986 than almost every other year of comics history as well. But you did get new stuff that was different and was cool and was weird. Yummy Fur by Chester Brown and Lloyd Llewellyn by Daniel Close, which are alternative books that are well celebrated, started. Omaha the Cat Dancer by Kate Worley and Reed Waller debuted. We're going to find out that actually comes up a little later when, the police start arresting people because they're selling it. But we'll get to that. All sorts of other books, like black and white books, start coming out. So because of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, everybody who's got access basically to a photocopier or a couple $100 where they can do a short print run is printing their own comics. We get all sorts of things that come out of that, including aristocratic extraterrestrial time-traveling thieves and all sorts of other Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle knockoffs, plus a bunch of other books that are maybe a little bit more original, like Fist Police, but still are kind of in that very low cost, low production value, in many cases, sort of how I don't want to say that the creators have less talent, but they're definitely less polished. A lot of young folks who probably should have had a few more years of honing their craft before they were publishing books. Instead, we're grabbing a bit of lunch money, publishing a comic, and it was making it into comic shops.
Yeah, I remember we read one of those when we were doing our review of the most recent Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie to come out last year.
Yep. is correct.
All right. So, what about like industry trends or stats? What were we seeing as far as just, I guess, comics in general? Were we lots of new
So,
stuff then? I guess because of all that like self-publishing sort of stuff that was going on.
so heading into my SQL database and taking a look through the comics.org information, I found 116 new comics publishers in America in that started in 1986. So it's not
Ah,
116
wait.
books. It's
No, that.
116 new publishers.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So it's kind of insane. 64 of the ones that I saw only ever published one series and in many cases one issue before folding.
Oh wow.
Okay? So about half of them never survived the year. We did have a few of them though that really did make an impact. The primary one is a title called or a publisher called Dark Horse. Dark Horse Comics started in 1986 with actually a sort of knockoff or a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles type book. The first book, or one of their first books, was called Boris the Bear Slaughters the Teenage Radioactive Black Belt Mutant Ninja Critters. And this was astonishingly like a major hit. It sold 80,000 copies or whatever, enough that they were able to then start to build the Dark Horse brand off of that and a Dark Horse Presents book that came out that year. That has since become a very important publisher. It does all the Hellboy stuff. There's lots of other things that it's been up to the last couple decades.
I was gonna say that's a publisher I recognize.
Yep. We also got Viz, started in America in 1986. Viz has been publishing westernized versions of manga for decades now and has been a primary driver of sort of getting Japanese manga over into the American market. So they began in 1986. We also had a few others. There were, I think, 6 or 7? Slave Labor Graphics, MU Press, Now, Mattel Comics, Apple Press, and Eternity are the other titles from that 116 that ended up putting out at least 20 titles before they folded. So there were about less than 10 of those 116 who stuck around long enough to make an impact, but there were a few. The other thing that's nice, there were no major publisher closings. There were a number of the new 1986 publishers, which technically folded in 1986, but they actually didn't exist before 1986.
Right.
So
right.
take that as you will.
Uh-huh.
And we started to see some of the legal problems and repercussions of that pop up because we did this year have 2 Illinois comic shops that actually got in trouble. One of them for selling mature comics to a minor. They actually sold, I believe it was Alien Worlds number 5, which is a really cool Pacific comic that is one of those that it did have some nudity in it, and they did sell it to somebody who was like 14 or 12 years old or something like this, and they should have known better, but they didn't. We also had another Illinois store, and this all happened because there was a new pornography law put in Illinois in 86 that got in trouble for selling, among other things, Omaha the Cat Dancer, and then a number of books that were also more semi-mainstream. But Omaha the Cat Dancer is actually about a cat who is an erotic dancer who then goes around having sex as in naked in the comic pretty much regularly. So it was literally pretty pornographic. And it was in the stores. I think the thing that's interesting about this is that over time, what this ended up doing is it made it so that a lot of comic retailers had to make a choice in one of two directions. They either had to severely restrict the inventory that they had, or be very careful who they sold it to, and make sure that the people they hired would be careful with that, or they just had to start discouraging kids from coming into the store at all. And what a lot of them, I think, did is that second part, is that 1986 becomes the first year where we start to see that comic book stores are going to move in a direction where they just aren't a welcome place for kids. And partly that's because people are getting arrested because there's lots of stuff in a comic book store that can get the store in trouble if kids are browsing it. Because one of them, there was an off-duty cop or something who was in, and he saw a kid browsing a heavy metal magazine or something like this, right? So, never mind, heavy metal was on sale all over the place at that time. So. Nonetheless,
right.
So that was not great. But,
yeah. All right. So, what about award season? What did we have for awards this year?
So I'm just going to the Kirby Awards now. We're going to let the Eagle Awards go their own way. They're still going on, but that's British. And since we've got the Kirby Awards, we're going to stick with them. Basically, Daredevil wins for Best Issue. Continuing series is Swamp Thing. Best Black and White series, Love and Rockets wins. And Love and Rockets at this point is really sort of hitting its groove. It's fantastic. Gilbert Hernandez and Jaime Hernandez have been at this now for about 4 years, doing great work. Best Finite Series, Crisis on Infinite Earths wins. New Series, Miracle Man. Best Graphic Album was The Rocketeer. Best Artist, Steve Rude. Best Writer, Alan Moore. And then Best Writer Artist, you get Frank Miller and Mazzucchelli on Daredevil. And Best Art Team, George Perez and Jerry Ordway for Crisis on Infinite Earths. I can't really argue with any of these. I think that they're both fantastic. What I do think is interesting is that in retrospect, neither Dark Knight, nor Mouse, nor Watchmen won any awards the year that it came out.
Yeah, that's, given how celebrated they are now, that is a bit surprising.
No. Now, they're going to have more time because at least Watchmen doesn't complete until 1987. I had some delays and the like, and plus it was a 12-issue series. And I'm not exactly sure that Dark Knight finished in 86 as well. I think that might have had its last issue come out in 87. So they may have another chance in the next Kirby Awards. But for this year, 3 of those 4 long-term lauded series did not win any love at the actual awards show for the year they came out.
All right. Before we move and talk about Marvel, Dan, what would you say is your favorite this year outside of Marvel?
So I'd like to say I was one of these sophisticated people who was digging on Love and Rockets or Lloyd Llewellyn or something, but it was Dark Knight, man. That bowled me over. I'd been reading Batman a long time. I had long been of the opinion that the Joker was just a problem, that at a certain point Batman should just, throw off a building and be done with. And there was something very nice about seeing that with how angry I was at the Joker over the years, because that really is kind of and obviously at the end, I am of the opinion Batman does not actually kill the Joker. I think the Joker breaks his own neck so he can blame the Batman. But different people will have different opinions on that as to exactly how it rolls. But overall, Dark Knight, just a fantastic series. And at that age, with what I was reading, it was revelatory. So I really enjoyed it.
All right, yeah, you're giving me more reason to want to read that story. So thank you for that. All right, we've looked at the big picture. I think we move on and talk about Marvel more specifically. The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
All right, Dan, obviously we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Daredevil Born Again during the Daredevil portion, but what else was Marvel doing in 1986? What should we be talking about with regards to Marvel this year?
First off, congratulations to Marvel and to us, because Marvel Universe hit a quarter century this year, which means we are a quarter century into our little voyage as well. I think for us it's 23 episodes or 24 episodes, something like that. But for them it's 25 years. So Fantastic Four turned 25 in 1986. We also had Marvel's first full release live action movie based on one of its comic books, released this year.
Wait, what? What is this?
The legendary Howard the Duck.
I am not familiar with this, if I'm being perfectly honest.
You really owe it to yourself to probably have a number of beverages and then sit down and watch the Howard the Duck movie one of these days. It is kind of terrible, but also kind of awful, kind of awesome. So the interesting thing about it is that when it was announced, we had massive expectations of this because it was actually produced by George Lucas. It starred Leah Thompson, who was sort of in the, Back to the Future movies and all of this sort of thing. Everything about this told me that it was going to be a lot of fun. And it was, in fact, one of the biggest bombs in the history of Hollywood at that time.
No.
So it made about $38 million compared to something like a $37 million budget or something like that.
Oh, no.
But that doesn't account all, the advertising and the other stuff.
Marketing,
Lost a ton of money. And it was nominated for 7 Razzie Awards, taking home 4 of them that year.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if you know what the Razzies are, but they're not good.
Yes, they celebrate what's awful in cinema, right?
Yep. So
no, I've not seen this. This is new to me. I think I may have heard about it at one point, but yeah, it slipped my mind that this was ever actually a thing before, like, say, the Marvel Cinematic Universe came along in the early or late 2000s.
I should note also that if you're in a crowd with an argumentative sort of, comic book know-it-all, calling this the first Marvel movie may cause a debate because technically the Captain America serials from 1944 were released in theaters, but they weren't actually feature productions. They were serials. So tell them that if they try to bring that he is not the. So yeah, this is a disaster. It was awful. Steve Gerber was credited as a based on, but he does not have an actual. He does not have a credit on the script itself. So that was a bomb, which wasn't great. We did, however, have Marvel really kind of looking to the future and going on all cylinders. So the thing is that at this point, the rumor is that Marvel is selling for over $100 million a year, and that they are in fact selling something like 7 million comic books per month as of 1986. So it is a fantastic change from where they'd been a few years ago. Their highest selling book, Uncanny X-Men, is selling about 480,000 copies a month. And in most years, it is by far the highest selling title. Again, Man of Steel sort of blew past it this year. But normally, they're selling like 70% of the comics in America. They are a juggernaut. Everything's great. We also then have Marvel president, James Galton, who we haven't talked about before. He's been kind of in the background. But he gave an interview and talked about the fact that Marvel has now diversified their line to where they've got the Epic line for sort of older readers and more mature content. They've got the Star line for kids. And they're even now starting to come out with what they're calling the Tender Hearts line, which is a series of sort of like books / comic books that are kind of a hybrid that they're doing in cooperation with the Harlequin company for like Harlequin romances to bring out a new line of sort of comic book graphic novels for young women that are romance books. Essentially, what they're trying to say is that the company wants to make sure they keep expanding past the traditional young boy demographic that they'd really been noticing was kind of their thing in the 70s and into the early 80s. And they're going to work to keep their characters, what they say, in the forefront of American consciousness. So as of 1986, Jim Shooter is trying to do all sorts of stuff to get things out there. Looks like Marvel President is kind of on the same path. They've got all sorts of stuff they want to do. Shooter, in fact, wanted to actually, kind of like he'd threatened a couple of years ago, he did want to just blow up the entire Marvel universe, close everything down with a bow on it, and then reboot with a brand new universe starting Spider-Man over, starting Captain America over, starting everything over, so that they could clean up the continuity. He was unable to convince his corporate overlords that blowing up $100 million a year juggernaut was a good idea.
I suppose, yeah.
and so instead, what they did allow him to do was create a new sort of pocket universe. They called it the New Universe, and it debuted to much fanfare this year. Eventually, he's going to have like 8 or 9 books. The problem is, he was promised about $120,000 or something like this to launch this line so he could get the best artists and writers, he could publicize it, and they could really do it right and make it work. Just as he was getting ready to do that, though, Marvel decided they were going to sell. And so what happened instead, as the company that owned Marvel, Cadence Industries, decided to cut all their costs, they essentially took away his $120,000 budget. They raided the pension fund. They killed morale. They cut costs everywhere. They probably cheated the existing shareholders, from what I can tell, because somehow the shareholders managed to only get about 2/3 of what the stock was supposedly worth at the time of the sale. And, as far as everybody can tell, the Cadence board and the executives raked in spectacular amounts of cash.
Wow.
So they tanked the company, took out all the profits, sold it for $50 million to a company called New World Pictures, which is a film production company, and then ran out the back door with their bags of money over their shoulder. Unfortunately...
I was going to say, so what does that mean to the new universe? That probably isn't good.
New Universe got none of the new creators, got none of the publicity. So what they were hoping to do is differentiate it by having, like the Frank Millers and the John Burns and all these guys come in and launch it. And instead, you had a bunch of people who were sort of the mid-level Marvel writers and artists who weren't necessarily going to get any excitement going for something. And it didn't really seem all that different from a regular mid-title Marvel book, which is kind of what they sold as. And so most of these would survive for a year or two. Maybe like 30 issues, I think, was about the most. But they never really made much of a dent, and they certainly didn't expand out into being some new major part of the Marvel Universe. So, burying the lead there, Marvel is sold this year. So we do have a new owner in New World Pictures. And they, of course, being a film TV production company, again, are starting to look more into the IP and how they can leverage that and how they can find new ways to kind of get these characters and these ideas out into the media. So,
interesting.
Outside of that, we had 137 different titles in 1986, which is actually down a bit from last year. Cyclops had a son. Bruce Banner and Betty Ross marry. We had something called the Mutant Massacre that resulted in the death of most of the Morlocks, as well as all sorts of weird things going on around other books in the Marvel Universe.
What are the Morlocks?
The Morlocks were a group of sort of misfit mutants who were unable to live among the human population without being discovered, who ended up going down and living in sort of the sewers and the underground of New York, led by a woman named Callisto. And eventually, Storm takes over this group. And so it's basically a lot of the sort of extra mutants in the Marvel Universe were starting to pile up. And Jim Shooter's like, I want them gone. And so they just literally massacred them. So it was kind of crazy. But it was very successful in terms of sales. A lot of people were angry about all the books coming out and that you had to do that and that you had these crossovers. But again, sales went up on every book that was a crossover. So we continued to teach the company exactly the wrong lesson. Right. And they continued to do exactly what we told them to. So
we told them what to do with our wallets, not with our words, apparently.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. So what about like new titles? Something that actually like kind of stood or like actually stood the test of time a little bit? What kind of book, or what were some of those new books that we saw?
Of the new books that came out this year, there were a few that were long term. X Factor became the second new X-Men series, essentially returned the original X-Men, including a revived Jean Grey. Um, if you remember, Shooter said that Jean Grey could not come back and had to die because of her involvement in killing the 6 billion people earlier in the X-Men.
Right.
They decided they wanted her back, though. So what someone discovered was that in actual fact, when the Phoenix Force had taken over Jean Grey or merged with her in like X-Men 109, what had really happened is Jean had been exhausted and sort of like depleted by her energy saving the team, crashed into the water. The Phoenix Force took her form and pretended to be Jean Grey for the next 25 issues of X-Men, eventually ending in it being destroyed for its sins. And then later on, there was a cocoon found at the bottom of the ocean. The Fantastic Four opened it up, and inside there's the real Jean Grey, who in no way participated in the killing of 6 billion people and could thus return to the X-Men.
It's
no problem.
just fine to be a member of the X-Men going forward.
It's a Christmas miracle.
It's amazing how well that worked out for them, wanting to have Jean Grey back like that.
So
okay,
nuts. But so that one went 150 issues. Most of it under Louise Simonson. We're going to find that in issue, I think it's 5 or 7 or something of that, they actually bring out one of our big new characters of the year too, which is Apocalypse. It's going to be a huge X-Men villain over the years. They named a movie after him a couple of years ago, so you can tell that he's important. We had The Nom, which I think is one of the most interesting books of the 80s. There was a vet named Doug Murray who'd written a story that was drawn by Michael Golden a few years ago. And Larry Hama got them together and said he wanted them to do a book on Vietnam because G.I. Joe was popular. And they're like, well, we don't want to do G.I. Joe, but what they did want to do, Murray wanted to tell the story of Vietnam through a comic book, 1 month at a time, detailing the actual life of soldiers in country. And so what the Nom became was every month was 30 days later in the history of the Vietnam War. So it starts with this young soldier being dropped off at the beginning of his sort of tour. And then 12 months later, he rotates out and you get other new characters. But this whole thing, and it ended up going like 7 years, not the full 8, but it essentially tracked the full history of the Vietnam War. Some people thought it was disrespectful because you're dealing with something like Vietnam in a comic book. Other people thought it was absolutely brilliant. I think most people who didn't like comic books or didn't respect them thought the dealing of this sort of thing in a comic book was really sort of crass.
Right.
But if you knew who Doug Murray was and you knew what he was trying to do and how good the book was, I think it was a fantastic sort of indictment of everything going on in Vietnam and some really spectacular history being told in comic book form, right there smack dab in the middle of the Marvel, universe. So
right.
Michael Golden stuck around for a while. His art was fantastic on the early issues. I actually really enjoyed it. It was tough to read sometimes, but it was really good.
I would have to imagine that it would be. My goodness.
No,
that sounds like something interesting to read.
It's also interesting that it came out about a year before Platoon and the Full Metal Jackets and all of this other stuff that started re-examining Vietnam. So in many ways, Murray anticipated that the American public was sort of now ready to start looking at Vietnam in a more serious and sort of questioning way. And then we'd see, Stone and some of these other people with their movies come out and do that in the years after. So it was really very important series as well. Not, given it quite as much of a profile as some of those other ones we talked about, but it's a big one. Classic X-Men were reprints of the early new X-Men books that then also had some additional stories added to them. They had new Arthur Adams covers. There was John Bolton art and a lot of the stories inside. They were really pretty amazing. I think that this was a almost like a class in how to do reprints if you want people to not feel like they're being robbed. Because even if you already had all of these old books from the 70s and early 80s, it was still worth it just for all the other stuff you were getting in here. G.I. Joe Special Missions ended up going 28 issues. That was just a second G.I. Joe book because G.I. Joe was going crazy at that point. And then we had Strike Force Morituri, which was originally going to be a New Universe book, ended up just being a science fiction comic. It ended up going like 30-some issues. I didn't really dig it, but I know that a lot of folks did. And as I'm a sci-fi fan, I sometimes think I should go back and give that one another look. And then we had the New Universe. DP7, Justice, Cyforce, Starbrand, Kickers Incorporated, Mark Hazard, Merc, Night Mask, and Spitfire and the Troubleshooters. And all of these books had the same conceit, and that is that they would be set in our universe. Literally, there's no magic. There is no aliens. There's no any of this. It's just a regular Earth, except there's what's called the White Event, which is a point at which certain people gain powers. And then how does the world look with that? It's almost like the Boys universe or something like that, only in, the 80s. So definitely not like the Boys. But that would have definitely gotten comic shops shut down. But
Yeah.
But each month, similar to the Nom, things progressed in regular time so that it would always be the current month in those books. And all of the normal physics and everything else had to be observed. So it was an interesting idea. Again, survived for a while, didn't go on too long.
What about limited series? We've talked about a lot of books that their whole intent was a short run or maybe even just a single issue. What new stuff were we seeing there?
There was a bunch of them. Just to do a few of the highlights. The Punisher series was a 4-issue originally, but 5-issue ended. Miniseries by Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck was fantastic and sort of was the thing that started the Punisher on the way to being kind of the sales juggernaut he was in the late 80s and 90s. We had Dakota North, which was a miniseries starring a female private eye. Notable primarily for the fact that this was the first time in a long time where Marvel had, after the cancellation of Dazzler, they had no books whatsoever headlined by female characters for the first time in a long while. So it'd always been a Spider-Woman book or something or whatever. We also got a Firestar miniseries, another G.I. Joe miniseries called Order of Battle. Transformers Universe came out, which was kind of an almanac type thing. We had the Howard the Duck movie adaptation, which I think they'd expected would do better than it probably did. We had a Labyrinth movie adaptation, Transformers movie adaptation. And the Transformers, the movie, that was an animated movie, but they still did a comic book on it. Mad Balls was one of those weird meme type products they did one on. And then Epic had 2 miniseries, Elektra Assassin by Miller and Sienkiewicz and Steel Grip's Sharky. We'll talk a little bit about the Elektra Assassin book later on. But there also were 4 Marvel graphic novels, Amazing Spider-Man in Hookie, Doctor Strange's Shambhala, Daredevil's Love and War, again with Miller and Sienkiewicz, and Marvel graphic novel of The Alien Legion, A Gray Day to Die. Those were all actually, I liked Shambhala, I liked Gray Day to Die. Love and War by Miller Sienkiewicz is a very interesting book. So,
and we were talking about those books before the show, in that it's great that they're there, but we can't get those on Marvel Unlimited. So are they more difficult to find then?
No, you just go out to my, long boxes, and then you pull the right issues
Sure.
out, and then you reread them like I did. So
Yeah, there you go.
sorry about that.
Yes.
No, they're not that difficult to find, and they're not that expensive, but I mean they're not on Marvel Unlimited, and they're not anywhere, that's easy and legal to get without having to buy them. And so
Right.
I didn't figure it made much sense, especially with the fact that they're not direct content. I will talk in the next part about the things maybe that made them have some information you'd want to know as a Daredevil fan, and I think that's all we need to know. But
Gotcha.
did mean there were 2 other Miller Daredevil products this year outside of the regular line.
Yeah, that sucks. I would have actually liked to have read those, and yeah. So
This was frustrating to me in '86 as a note, because Marvel was doing this a lot with these graphic novels. Remember, they're only available in the direct market. And when you've got something like the New Mutants graphic novel, for instance, that launched an entire new group of Marvel mutants. And I could get the comic book. I could get New Mutants #1 when it came out on the newsstand. But I couldn't get the graphic novel because it didn't go to the newsstand. So that's where they were introduced. That's where you learn all about the characters. And then issue #1 is sort of like, oh, this is issue 2 essentially, and I've missed #1. And so I feel your pain, sir.
Yeah.
I absolutely feel your pain.
All right, so what about new characters? It would seem to me that there's going to be a lot of characters.
There are, but not that many that really matter. So
Okay.
Our big one is Apocalypse.
Sure.
He is, or I should say, one of our 2 big ones is Apocalypse. He is one of the primary villains of the X-Men universe going forward, and he is a big bad. In many ways, he's kind of like the dark side of the X-Men universe, right? We also have Eddie Brock, who's going to become the Venom, essentially the one that the Venom symbiote primarily attaches to. And so Eddie Brock is going to also be a pretty important guy in terms of going forward in the Spider-Man universe and then the Venomverse. Dakota North, of course, we don't see that much of her. She pops up occasionally. We get the Marauders in the Mutant Massacre, and they'll go on to continue to be foils for the X-Men. We do get the TVA, the Time Variance Authority, is mentioned for the first time in Thor 372. So that's when that started up. I assume that comic's worth a lot more now than it was 5 years ago. Because nobody would have known what the Time Variance Authority was or cared about it before Loki got there. And then we have U.S. Agent, he was the one that in Falcon and Winter Soldier, he was the sort of the antagonist that they had. John Walker is going to be the guy who comes in and tries to take over as Captain America. And he's just not right in the head all the time. So there are problems with him. Outside of that, I will list X-Men names: Berserker, Rusty Collins, Cameron Hodge, Artie Maddox, Prism, and Skids. Some Spider-Man people. We had Chance, Foreigner, Sinister Syndicate, and Solo. And then outside of that, we had Mayhem and Cloak and Dagger. Nuke came in Daredevil. Let's talk about that a little later. Persuasion and Alpha Flight. And I guess Tollbooth from G.I. Joe. There's a few G.I. Joes. But none of those are big ticket items, right? Basically, you've got Apocalypse and Eddie Brock as your 2 big hitters. Time Variance Authority as an organization. And that's really about it in terms of major characters.
Sure. Okay. How about series that ended this year?
We did have some series end. We start to see a little bit of essentially the product fatigue of just the number of books that they'd put out. We also see some of the cutbacks that Cadence is doing while they're getting ready to implement their sale. And just some of these maybe ran their course. So Defenders had 152 issues before it ended. That by far was the longest running title that ended in '86. Star Wars ended at 107. That was actually a really good selling title for Marvel from what I've heard, but it sounds like they kept having trouble getting the ability to tell the stories they wanted from Lucasfilm, because Lucasfilm was not sure they wanted to have the comics telling stories they might use.
Right.
One sort of funny little thing is that the somebody at Lucasfilm was questioned about the canceling of the Star Wars series in '86, and they said it's not canceled; it's just on hiatus until the next movie, which means 15, 16 years or something like that, I guess.
Oh, Jesus.
So, because this was after Return of the Jedi, so there was crickets for a long time. But so that ends that. Rom ended in honorable death in issue 75 with everything wrapped up and one of the best complete stories in the history of the Marvel Universe. Power Man and Iron Fist ended at 59. Dazzler went to 42 and closed. Marvel Super Special and Thing and Epic Illustrated, Further Adventures of Indiana Jones and Howard the Duck were all over 30 issues when they closed up shop. Dreadstar, Doctor Who, Micronauts, Coyote were all over 20, or I guess Coyote was 16. And then Red Sonja, Wally the Wizard, Eternals, and Planetary. So you get a couple, we're over 12 issues. So you get a couple of kids' titles. You get a number of the direct market titles like Micronauts, closing again. A number of epic titles like Dreadstar and Epic Illustrated. So from pretty much all over the enterprise, there were things starting to close up a little bit. And most of what replaced them were miniseries. So.
Gotcha. All right. So what does the bullpen look like then at this point? You talked about the sale this year. What did that mean for their staffing size? And is Jim Shooter still the editor-in-chief?
Are you foreshadowing for 1987? Are you foreshadowing?
Unintentionally, maybe?
For this year, Jim Shooter is still the editor-in-chief. The staff is over 300 people still. You've got lots of editors and everywhere. We do lose John Byrne this year due to an editorial argument he has, and due to the fact that he really wants to go over and do Superman anyways. So his exclusive contract with Marvel ended at the exact same time that the chance to be the guy who restarts Superman after 50 years or 40 years came out. And so he jumped ship to do that. Shooter also is angry about the fact that Cadence is trying to mess with his royalty schedules. Cadence is messing with a lot of his other things like health benefits and of course the pension fund and everything. And he actually complained about this to the incoming chief of New World Media, which instead of, because it's corporate America, instead of getting him a gold star, got him labeled as a whistleblower and a troublemaker by the new folks and got him off to a bad start with the new management. So, one might say his days could be numbered.
Yeah, no good deed goes unpunished.
Correct. But it is good that he did that because, I mean, again, the sliding scale of Shooter goes back up again. That when it came down to it, he did try to protect his people and see what he could get done. And in the end, he gets screwed for it. So there you go.
All right, so what about Rookie of the Year? Who's the new person that comes in that we're going to be talking about throughout the next few years or decades plus?
So normally I bury the lead on this and talk about 9 other people or whatever, but we've got a lot of comics to talk about and a lot of Daredevil to go. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that Alan Davis, who goes on to have brilliant runs as an artist on X-Men and Excalibur and tons of covers. He did a number of really cool books with Thor and the like. He does some work as a writer. He does a lot of work as an artist. I think he's done some inking. He's going to be my Rookie of the Year. He came over from Britain. He's another one of the British imports. He'd done some stuff previously with Warrior Magazine, and he was one of the people who'd worked on Miracle Man, or I guess at that point Marvel Man with Alan Moore. But he is one of my favorite artists, and His Kitty Pryde is, to me, the sort of de facto classic Kitty Pryde. If Jim Aparo is the classic Batman, he is the classic Kitty Pryde. And he absolutely is somebody who's been with the company for like 20 years and deserves to be recognized. So I'm going Alan Davis for 1986.
Gotcha. All right. Before we jump in and start talking about Daredevil, Dan, what was your favorite comic for Marvel this year?
So I went back and really looked at this. I was very basic in this time, I'm afraid, because I loved the Punisher series as well. Mike Zeck's art on this is just fantastic. I mean, it was so fluid, and he made the Punisher huge. Like he was one of the first people who really pumped up the Punisher to make him look kind of like that bodybuilder and the like. But again, I think my mileage would vary on this if I went back and read this. But I know that I absolutely adored the Punisher series as a 17-year-old. I feel kind of bad about that now because I'm deeply conflicted on all things Punisher at this point and kind of where that's all gone. But God, this was a good series. It was, again, intended to be 5 issues or 4. The first 2 say it's a 4-issue miniseries. The third one says it's a 5-issue miniseries. On the cover, it says issue 1 of 1 or 1 of 4. Then it says issue 2 of 4. It says issue 3 of 5 and issue 4 of 5, 4 of 4, and then issue 5 of 5 or something like that. It's very confusing.
Sure.
Because they didn't even know. And even worse, the final issue, number 5, is not done by Zeck and Grant. It's done by a different team. But it still works and finishes out. What happened, evidently, is that they just did not give Zeck enough time to draw all 5 issues, and so somebody else had to come in to do the 5th one, which kind of sucks. But,
yeah.
But he did a great job on it. I love that book.
All right, Dan, we've spent a good deal of time talking about comics as a whole and Marvel more specifically. I think it's time that we start talking about Matt Murdock and Daredevil this year because he had a pretty big year in his own right.
I do want everyone out there, dear listeners, to congratulate me, though, for the fact that within a little over an hour, I dealt with what I thought was an impossible amount of information. So there you go. I'm not apologizing for my 1 hour and 3 minutes. It's the best I could have possibly done.
Hats off to you, Dan. Let's talk about Daredevil.
Hey there, folks. This is Dan from the editing booth. That's going to end it for this week. We ended up having almost a 2-hour episode for 1986, so we're going to split it into parts. We're going to do part 1 this week, part 2 next week. So we've gotten through our section on comics as a whole and what was going on in Marvel, and next week we'll be back with a whole hour dedicated to Daredevil Born Again. See you then, folks.